Basic economics. Taxes. How taxes on buyers affect market outcomes. So, let's talk about how a tax on buyers, like the one for ice cream cones, affects the market.
Sure. I've heard taxes can change how much people buy.
Exactly. When a tax is imposed, it mainly affects the demand curve first.
How does that work? What happens to the demand for ice cream?
Well, when buyers have to pay an additional 50 cents tax per cone, they find it less attractive to buy ice cream.
So, they buy less? That makes sense.
Right. The demand curve shifts to the left, meaning buyers demand fewer cones at every price.
How much does it shift? Is it just the amount of the tax?
Yes, it shifts exactly by the size of the tax. So, if the market price is $2, the effective price becomes $2.50.
That sounds significant. What happens to the equilibrium price and quantity?
Good question. The equilibrium price falls from $3 to $2.80, and the quantity drops from 100 to 90 cones.
So, both buyers and sellers are affected by this tax?
Exactly. Buyers pay more overall, and sellers receive less per cone. They share the tax burden. How taxes on sellers affect market outcomes. Have you ever thought about how taxes on sellers affect market outcomes?
Not really, but I'd like to know more about it.
All right. Let's say the government imposes a 50 cents tax on each ice cream cone sold. What do you think happens first?
I guess it affects the sellers since they have to pay that tax.
Exactly. The tax raises the cost of selling ice cream, which means sellers will supply less at every price point. The supply curve shifts to the left.
So, if the price of a cone was $2, sellers would only effectively receive $1.50 after the tax?
Correct. The market price has to rise to compensate for that tax. If the price goes up, sellers will supply a smaller quantity of ice cream.
And what happens to the buyers in this scenario?
Good question. The buyers end up paying more. For instance, if the equilibrium price rises from $3 to $3.30, that's a 30 cents increase for them.
So, sellers get a higher price, but their effective price drops to $2.80 after the tax?
Exactly. Both buyers and sellers share the burden of the tax, regardless of who pays it to the government.
That's interesting. So, it doesn't really matter if the tax is on buyers or sellers, right?
You got it. The tax creates a wedge between the price buyers pay and the price sellers receive, leading to the same market outcome. Case study: can Congress distribute the burden of a payroll tax? Have you ever noticed the deductions on your paycheck? One of them is for FICA, which stands for the Federal Insurance Contribution Act.
Yeah, I see that. But what exactly does it fund?
It funds important programs like Social Security and Medicare for the elderly. In 1999, the total FICA tax was 15.3% of earnings.
So, who really pays this tax? Is it the workers or the firms?
Great question. Congress tried to split the burden evenly, with half paid by firms and half deducted from workers' paychecks.
But does that mean it's actually a 50-50 split in reality?
Not necessarily. The actual burden depends on supply and demand, not just the legislation. A payroll tax creates a wedge between what firms pay and what workers receive.
So, if the law says it's split, it might not be in practice?
Exactly. Even if the tax is levied entirely on workers or firms, the outcome remains similar. The burden distribution isn't simply determined by lawmakers.
That's really interesting. It shows how complex tax systems can be.
Yes, and it emphasizes the importance of understanding tax incidence in public debates. It's not just about who pays the tax, but how it impacts the economy. Elasticity and tax incidence. So, when a tax is imposed on a good, do you know how the burden is shared between buyers and sellers?
I think it depends on how elastic the supply and demand are, right?
Exactly. If the supply is very elastic and demand is inelastic, sellers bear less of the burden.
That makes sense. So, buyers end up paying a higher price when the tax is added?
Right. In that case, the price paid by buyers increases significantly, while sellers only see a small drop in what they receive.
And what about the opposite scenario?
In a market with inelastic supply and elastic demand, sellers bear most of the tax burden.
So buyers don't see much of a price increase in that case?
Correct. The price buyers pay remains relatively stable, while the price sellers receive drops significantly.
Why does this happen? Is it just about alternatives?
Yes. Elasticity reflects how willing buyers or sellers are to leave the market when conditions change. Less elasticity means they have fewer alternatives.
That's really interesting. So, in the case of payroll taxes, workers bear more of the burden?
Exactly. Most labor economists agree that labor supply is less elastic than labor demand, meaning workers feel the impact more.